Eli Drinkwitz typically doesn't give true freshmen a lot of action, but I think Williams Nwaneri is going to very much be the exception to that rule. Let's talk about the talented defensive lineman and more right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso, and a man who's officially back to 5 podcasts a week. Yes, your team every day here at the Locked On Podcast Network. Excited to be back here daily to coincide with the start of SEC Media Days, which more or less that's kind of the end of the off season, right? Unofficially, I would say. Of course, practice will be starting here in a couple weeks. We got a ton to get to on the podcast today, including when the dink and dunk offense of Eli Drinkwitz officially, in my opinion, became the dink and chunk offense that we came to know and love in 2023. Before we start the program, though, I do want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first ticket purchase. Terms apply. And of course, we got tons of hype about Williams Nwaneri, the Lee Summit product, maybe the best player in the country, depending on who you talk to from the high school ranks. But a defensive end, defensive lineman, a young man who has all of the requisite size, number one, at 6'6", 257 pounds. Yeah, he's plenty big to play defensive end in the SEC already. It must be nice to be 18 years old and already have your man's body. I promised you, I did not know what that was all about. But Williams Nwaneri is a gifted young man in so many ways, and I don't mean to put too much pressure on him. I really don't, because I'm not sitting here and telling you I believe Williams Nwaneri is going to come in and start and be an all-SEC type of player or anything like that. I think that's putting way too much pressure and unrealistic pressure on the young man. But what I don't think is unrealistic is that Nwaneri can play this season and make a significant impact for the Tigers. I think he can absolutely, again, with his obvious size and talent that he has, sure, he's not going to be as refined of a player technique-wise as he's going to be in a couple years' time, for example. But right now, he's just physically talented enough that I believe he can absolutely be a problem as a pass rusher, at the very least an option as a pass rusher on third down. And if he can get to the quarterback on obvious passing situations, well, guess what, folks? That means you're a difference maker already. And I believe that's what Williams Nwaneri can be as a true freshman for the Tigers here. Again, I'm not saying he's going to play 45 to 50 snaps a game or anything like that, but can he play 10 to 15 snaps early in the season? Maybe get that up to 20 to 25 or so by the end of the season? I think that's realistic. I really do. Really, shoot for 15 to 20 snaps a game, average somewhere in there, and I think that'd be a heck of a place to start Williams Nwaneri and what's promising to be a really, really good career for him in a Missouri uniform. Again, I'm not expecting him to be the difference maker on the entire defense or anything like that. I'm not trying to put tons of pressure on the kid. I just think that, again, obvious passing situations where he doesn't really have to worry about run fits or anything like that, just let him go get after the quarterback. I think he can be a difference maker in year one. Now, other than Nwaneri's obvious talent and abilities, well, part of my prediction there about Nwaneri being a difference maker, especially as just in pass rushing situations, is looking at the rest of that depth chart for Missouri, by the way. On the defensive end side, of course, Johnny Walker, the defensive MVP of the Cotton Bowl last season, returns as a senior. Obviously, he's locked into one side of the defense as an edge rusher, but what about the other side? I think it's much more up in the air. I think you probably put your money on Zion Young at this point, defensive end transfer. Similarly sized, by the way, just to give you an idea of a comparison there to Nwaneri. Zion Young also listed at 6'6", 265 pounds, just 8 more pounds there than Nwaneri, just giving you a good idea of, again, how that true freshman's body should play just fine very early, even in the SEC. But Zion Young, a junior transfer from Michigan State, probably the most likely guy to see most of the action opposite Johnny Walker early, I would say. But there's a few other guys who are certainly candidates as well. Joe Moore returns from last season. Yes, the Mizzou legacy. Joe Moore is a senior, former Arizona State transfer. Didn't wow me last season or anything like that. So again, I just think that there's opportunity there on the opposite side at defensive end. Various other guys could, of course, factor in there as well. Georgia Tech transfer Eddie Kelly is one. Ja'Kai Lang, a redshirt, a freshman from Troy, Missouri. And also Darius Smith, a transfer from Georgia, another name to certainly keep in mind there. Obviously a Georgia Bulldog transfer. That's going to makes your eyes a little bit wide. You think, ooh, he's a tremendous talent. And he probably is. He probably is a tremendous talent athletically. Obviously, something didn't quite work out there at Georgia. Maybe it's simply just a getting buried on the depth chart issue. Who knows? But it'll be interesting to see what happens there. All I would say is hopefully Missouri obviously can get the most out of Darius Smith, but I wouldn't guarantee production there simply because you're a transfer from the University of Georgia. We've seen guys with, flashy schools in the past, Alabama transfers, for instance, that didn't quite work out. So always just something to keep in mind there. Now, on the interior of the defensive line for Missouri, of course, you're definitely talking Christian Williams is your stalwart there. One thing to keep in mind, I think some people were surprised, like, oh, they're taking Christian Williams down there as one of the SEC media representatives, one of the 3 guys along with Brady Cook and Luther Burden. Well, keep in mind, those inside players, not always the most statistically flashy. For example, Sheldon Richardson in his 2 years at Missouri had 6 total sacks in 2 seasons, and yet Richardson was obviously a very productive player and went on to have a Pro Bowl caliber type of NFL career for a very long time. So Christian Williams is certainly a very good player, and more to the point, Missouri's done very well in the last couple years in the transfer market, getting big-bodied interior defensive linemen. So if you're going to be an optimist, then that should hopefully spell good things for Chris McClellan, the transfer from Florida. I think he's not only, 6'3", 320 pounds to go along with the 314-pound Christian Williams. Certainly size is not going to be a problem for Missouri on the interior. If McClellan is as athletic as Brandon Olson at Locked On Gators has led me to believe, then I think Missouri's going to be really happy with what they get from the interior defensive line this season. Of course, there's a bunch of other names as well. Marquise Gracial is now a sophomore. It seems like we've been waiting forever for him to bubble up the depth chart. It just hasn't happened yet. Jalen Marshall, another name to keep an eye on, and also Sterling Webb, a transfer from New Mexico State. Again, there's a lot of names there other than Christian Williams on the interior, and I would say Chris McClellan is probably an obvious starter as well. You've also got Johnny Walker on the outside. So really 3 of your 4 spots are pretty well established, at least on the first string. But to me, the rest of the depth there, just a lot of question marks, not necessarily bad question marks. I actually have quite a bit of faith in the Missouri defensive line coaches to figure this out. I think Al Davis has done, in particular, a very good job with these young men. So it's just going to be interesting to see how it all plays out on the interior and on the outside, especially opposite of Johnny Walker. But once again, just looking at how this is going to shape out, just kind of taking the 5,000-foot view, if you will, I think Williams Nwaneri is going to be a part of this defensive line rotation and be a significant one at a certain point. Now, on the offensive side of the ball, Missouri was obviously very good offensively last season, and I expect more of the same this year. But it did take a little bit of time for Kirby Moore and the Missouri offense to get going last year. In fact, I think there was a pretty obvious moment where the Missouri offense transformed from dink and dunk to what I would call dink and chunk last season. So let's talk about that here in just a little bit. First, though, eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With more than 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. If you're watching FS1 or ESPN all day, it's time to make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming about Slava Medvedenko, for example. Well, Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, news, all streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. And I did think, last season, I have to say, after week 2, Middle Tennessee, Missouri, wins a one-possession game against Middle Tennessee, by the way. And I was about as probably animated in podcast form as I've been on this program, especially after a Mizzou victory. And, I had a listener was asking me, hey, actually commented on my video that I did post-game from Middle Tennessee. And he said, hey, what do you think about this in retrospect? Well, obviously I overreacted, I think. That would be one thing to say. However, I'll also say I was far from alone with that. I think all Missouri fans were rather frustrated with the Missouri offense to start the season. I think we were looking for a little bit more explosiveness, to say the least, and just better offense in general. And frankly, after the first couple weeks, I thought it just looked like the same Missouri offense that we had seen from 2022, that at times was just a little bit too much dink and dunk. And a lot of what Missouri did last season was a lot of dinking, if you will. And I think you'll see that once again. You're going to see a lot of passes, screen passes to Luther Burden, for example, and various other receivers and that type of deal. And by the way, pretty effective plays for Missouri, by the way, for the most part. But it just felt like against Middle Tennessee, again, at the time, it just was like, oh, we're too conservative here. We barely beat Middle Tennessee. I thought this was the year we were supposed to break out. I was frankly a little bit frustrated after the game. But what happened was pretty quickly, once that frustration dissipated and I started doing my research for Kansas State in week 3, well, a lot of Missouri fans, I realized, were rather overly negative because when the line came out, Kansas State, I believe, was favored by 3.5, and Missouri fans were going, my God, what? Kansas State's going to murder us. How can this be less than a touchdown? Missouri, of course, was murdered by Kansas State the previous season in Manhattan, so not a lot of confidence heading into that matchup. But what happened rather early is to all the people who thought, you know what, maybe Missouri was just holding back, was just keeping its plays, keeping its plans under wraps, not trying to show the opponent too much. Well, those people proved to be correct. And my thing was, I immediately realized I was going, wait a minute. I know I was negative after this game, but I feel like everybody is just dismissing Missouri too much. So while I didn't pick the Tigers to win in that game, I was very much on the, hey, it's going to be a close game. I got the Tigers to cover. After what I saw in week 2, I wasn't confident enough to pick the Tigers outright, but I definitely said take the Tigers and the points for sure. Take the 3.5 points. And well, what happened there is in that ball game, hey, we all remember the 61-yard field goal, 62, 61, I already forget. The Harrison Mevis 60-plus yard field goal that goes in for the win. But what, to me, the biggest play of that game was arguably even before that. Maybe one of the biggest plays of the entire season was the play-action pass over the top to Luther Burden by Brady Cook for a touchdown, because that is the moment where I think Missouri found its identity. And maybe they realized, maybe Kirby Moore and Eli Drinkwitz knew what they were doing all along. Maybe they did. But going back and watching the film, I was telling people, again, this is a reason I picked Missouri. I was saying, hey, guys, there are shots down the field that are available here. Middle Tennessee is playing very aggressive defense here, and Missouri just kind of seems content to not take them right now. Well, take them they did against Kansas State, and in particular with the play-action game, that's something that Missouri figured out, I think, in week 3, or kept it under their sleeve, whatever you think happened there. The reality is Missouri went from, to me, dink and dunk type offense the first 2 weeks of the season. Suddenly they became dink and chunk. And that was, to me, their identity for the rest of the season. Yes, you had those jet sweeps and outside zone rushing, of course, which is really the biggest staple of the Missouri offense, is that outside zone run. As Missouri kept getting better at that as the season went along, by the way, guess what? The entire offense got better too. But a big part of it, again, Missouri found that, okay, you can just kind of death by 1,000 cuts and then eventually hit a big play over the top to Luther Burden or Marquise Johnson or Theo Weiss. Very, very effective stuff, and I think that's exactly the type of it's exactly the type of offense that defenses and defenders always say is incredibly difficult to defend. So I think you're going to see exactly more of that dink and chunk offense again in 2024 from Mizzou. And coming up, let's talk about the tight end position for Missouri when it comes to recruiting. And also I want to clean up, I forgot to mention Khalil Jacobs when I was talking about linebackers for Missouri recently. He could be an important part of the equation here, so I need to clean that up. Coming up here after these quick words. And once again, thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day. And for your second listen, check out Locked On Royals, why don't you? My Royals are in a pennant race. By golly, no better place to get all the action every day, of course, than over at Locked On Royals. But I do want to bring up Khalil Jacobs, who actually played under Missouri's new defensive coordinator, Corey Batoon, at South Alabama last season. Had 8.5 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, and an interception. Going to be interesting to see how much he plays at linebacker. Will he be an off-ball linebacker? Will he be an edge rusher? How is Jacobs going to be best used by Batoon? We'll just have to see. But definitely an important part of the linebacker equation that I neglected to bring up recently, so I wanted to clean that up for sure. But on the tight end position, when it comes to high school, well, frankly, Missouri has missed on its 2 visitors. Chase Lofton from Omaha, Nebraska, committed to Florida State, and also Ohio's Brody Lennon. Well, he jumped on a Buckeyes offer from Ohio State when he got it. Tough to blame the young man for that. But here's the thing. I don't necessarily think Missouri has to take a tight end in this class, in this 2025 cycle. You had Brett Norfleet, who is a true sophomore. He's pretty well entrenched at this point at the position. I think, by the way, like Norfleet, Jordan Harris is a true sophomore as well. I think the staff likes him as a player, certainly his blocking at the very least. So I just, Missouri also took a couple tight ends recently, including a Missouri legacy in Whit Hafer, the son of former Missouri basketball player Jeff Hafer. So I just think that really there's quite a bit of young talent and options at the tight end position on the Missouri roster right now. Of course, when a guy like Chase Lofton, who went to Florida State, or Brody Lennon, who goes to Ohio State, those type of kids, yeah, you'd absolutely take that level of talent. But I just don't think Missouri has to take a tight end in this class. I think they're actually okay at that position for now. And speaking of high school, well, pretty obvious at this point that the lion's share of this Missouri class is finished. There's still some big names out there that have taken official visits to Missouri, like Epi Epinesa, the kid from Iowa. He's an Iowa legacy defensive end. Some rank him as a 5-star player. I don't know how likely he is to Missouri, but the point is he, along with Kansas City, Kansas offensive lineman, Andrew Babalola. There's some big names out there who have visited Missouri who you could still get, of course, but probably 85% of this class is done at this point. So bottom line, that means Missouri is going to have a really, really good high school recruiting class, and maybe the highest ranked one they've ever had in the internet era before it's all said and done. And of course, well, the big news today is SEC Media Days down in Dallas, Texas, of course, in a nod to the new additions to the Southeastern Conference, of course, the Texas Longhorns and the Oklahoma Sooners. Nick Saban not wasting any time swinging his retirement stick around, saying Texas ain't going to run the SEC, end quote there from Nick Saban. Well, let's hope so, Nick, because so far everything that Texas has ever touched has turned basically to dust. I know the Big 12 is still around, but okay. It's kind of a Frankenstein monster at this point. Good for them for sticking around, by the way. I'm frankly a little bit impressed that the Big 12 has managed to stick around by being aggressive. I certainly got to give their leadership a tip of the cap compared to the Pac-12. That's for darn sure. But speaking of leadership in the conference, SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey, he did throw a bit of a bomb toward the Big Ten, saying we are the one conference where the name still means something. So he does believe that, hey, he wants to have that contiguous conference, geographically speaking. He wants it to be the Southeastern Conference. So what I take that to mean is don't expect the SEC to be knocking on the doors in the Pacific Coast, for example. So I just don't think UCLA, USC, that was never really on the conference's radar whatsoever. And frankly, that's why getting Texas and Oklahoma was such a huge coup. Those were the two biggest programs out there. But the fact that, again, it makes geographical sense, just like Missouri does and did as well. You can argue about, well, is that really the Southeast or not? Frankly, I've always considered, while Texas is certainly in the South, I've always considered the South sort of its own culture, the Deep South. And then there's Texas. Texas, to me, has its own culture. I'm not saying there's not a lot of crossover there, culturally speaking, but to me, Texas is just kind of its own thing. But regardless of that, SEC Commish Greg Sankey not wanting to hear it that anybody else has a better conference than his. That's for darn sure. And he's kind of signaling that, I'm not exactly recruiting for new schools right now, but if I had to guess, if I had to say, well, if the SEC eventually adds a couple squads, the ones that would make the most sense, well, Florida State, right? Clemson, Virginia, North Carolina, that type of thing, where you're still more or less in the geographic southeast of the country. I think those schools would make some sense. But quite honestly, 16 is a nice number. It really is. In terms of bracketing and that kind of stuff, I like the symmetry of it. So let's not go to 18, 19, 20. The heck with it. Can we just be done at 16, please? I know nothing stays the same forever these days, especially in the world of college football, but those are just my feelings. But hey, My feelings are to you, the listener. Thanks for listening. As always, thanks for making this show your first listen every day. And feel free to tell another true son or daughter about the podcast, LockedOnMizzou.com, for all your pertinent links to YouTube, Spotify, and of course, Amazon Prime for your ad-free experience as well. So until next time, I am John Miller, and this has been Locked on Mizzou.